The knock on the door came at 11:17 p.m., sharp and deliberate. Not the kind of knock you ignore. I had just settled onto the couch, nursing a scotch and flipping through channels without really watching. Clara, my wife of 7 years, had left earlier in the evening for what she called an impromptu girls' night. A bit unusual, but not unheard of. Except it wasn't like her to leave me alone with our 2 kids without more than a shrug and a half-hearted excuse. But that knock rattled something in me. I opened the door to find a man standing there. Late 30s, balding, with the kind of face you'd never remember. He wore a cheap suit and had a stack of papers clutched in one hand. He was sweating despite the chill in the air. "Ethan, right?" he asked. His voice was shaky, but there was something resolute in his eyes. He didn't wait for me to answer. "We need to talk. It's about your wife." Those words hit like a sucker punch. My first instinct was to slam the door in his face. But the way he looked at me, half sorry, half pitying, froze me in place. "Who the hell are you?" I managed, my voice rougher than I expected. "My name's irrelevant," he said, stepping closer to block the door from closing. "What matters is that Clara's been lying to you. 4 months. Maybe longer. And it's not just you, it's me too. She's been lying to both of us." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. My mind was already racing, trying to connect dots that hadn't even been presented yet. "She's my wife too," he said, his voice cracking. For a moment, the world stopped. Or at least it felt like it. The words hung there, ridiculous and impossible, but his eyes told me he wasn't joking. My blood turned cold. My wife, married to another man? The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh, but his expression killed any trace of humor. "I have proof," he added, pulling a thick manila envelope from inside his jacket. He handed it to me, and I stood there like an idiot, staring at it. My hands trembled as I took it. He didn't wait for me to say anything. He just turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway with my heart pounding and my stomach in knots. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew whatever was inside that envelope would rip apart the fabric of my life. But I did anyway. Because how could I not? And that's when it all started to fall apart. The man's words echoed in my head long after I closed the door. "She's my wife too." I stood there, clutching the envelope like it was a bomb about to go off. My stomach churned, a mix of confusion, rage, and the dread of what I might find. I glanced at the clock, 11:27 p.m., and decided against opening it right there in the hallway. The kids were asleep, and the last thing I needed was for them to wake up to me unraveling. I walked to the dining table, set the envelope down, and stared at it like it might bite. My hands hovered over the flap, but I hesitated. What was I about to uncover? Proof that my wife had another life? Or worse, that she wasn't who she claimed to be at all? I ran a hand over my face, exhaling sharply, before finally tearing the envelope open. The contents spilled out, a collection of photographs, documents, and even a marriage certificate. My hands shook as I sorted through them, each piece telling a story I wasn't ready to hear. There she was, Clara, smiling next to that man in what looked like a courthouse. Her hair was shorter, her dress casual, but it was undeniably her. The date on the certificate was 5 years before we'd met. I flipped through more photos, Clara and the man on vacations, Clara wearing what appeared to be a wedding ring, a ring I'd never seen in all our years together. And then there were receipts. Hotel bookings. Flights to cities she had no reason to visit. The most recent one was from last month, the same weekend she told me she was visiting her sister in Portland. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My head pounded as I tried to piece it together. How had I missed this? How had she hidden it so well? Was every moment of our marriage a lie, or was this something she had carried in secret, a part of her life she compartmentalized so perfectly that it never bled into mine? The sound of my phone buzzing on the counter snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, Clara. Her name blared back at me, innocent and normal, as if she weren't the woman whose double life was currently sprawled across our dining table. I ignored the call, letting it go to voicemail, but the buzzing started again almost immediately. I silenced the phone and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The last thing I needed was to talk to her right now. Not when I was barely keeping it together. I returned to the documents, flipping through them methodically, searching for more clues. There was a bank statement and account I didn't recognize. Deposits and withdrawals, all recent, all pointing to expenses that had nothing to do with our life together. Plane tickets, car rentals, dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. She had funded an entire other existence without me noticing. The audacity of it, the sheer nerve, made my blood boil. But the last item in the pile was the one that undid me completely. It was a letter, handwritten in Clara's neat cursive. The man must have copied it before delivering it to me. My eyes scanned the opening lines, and my chest tightened. Dearest Patrick, I know this situation is impossible, but I can't help the way I feel about you. Every time I'm with you, I feel alive in a way I never do at home. Ethan is a good man, but he doesn't make me feel the way you do. He doesn't challenge me, doesn't see me the way you do. I know I can't keep living this double life forever, but I don't know how to choose. I love you, but I can't leave my kids. Please understand. Yours always, Clara. I dropped the letter, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. The words swam in front of me, each one a dagger. He doesn't make me feel the way you do. I'd heard those kinds of lines before, always in some over-the-top drama I would roll my eyes at. But now they were written in my wife's handwriting, aimed squarely at me. I stood abruptly, my chair screeching against the floor. I couldn't stay here. Not in this house that suddenly felt like a stranger's. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, needing air, needing distance, needing to escape the suffocating reality I'd just uncovered. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to clear my head. I walked aimlessly down the street, hands shoved deep in my pockets, replaying the last 7 years in my mind. Every smile, every shared moment, every whispered I love you, were they all a performance? Or worse, a consolation prize? I thought about the man at the door, Patrick, and how defeated he had looked. He was in this mess too, though I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. He had been complicit in this, knowingly or not. And yet, there was something about the way he had delivered the envelope, the sadness in his eyes, that told me he hadn't wanted to destroy my life. He had just wanted answers. Just like me. I ended up at the park near our house, sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp. My mind raced as I tried to decide what to do next. Should I confront Clara? Wait for her to come home and demand the truth? Or should I stay silent, gather more evidence, and plan my next move? The thought of facing her made my stomach turn. I wasn't ready for the lies she would inevitably spin, the excuses she would offer. But I couldn't just sit here, stewing in my own anger and humiliation. I needed a plan. I pulled out my phone and searched for Patrick's number. It was scrawled on a note he had slipped into the envelope. My finger hovered over the call button, hesitating. Did I really want to talk to him again? Could I trust anything he said? Before I could second-guess myself, I hit the button and brought the phone to my ear. It rang twice before he answered. "It's Ethan," I said, my voice tight with barely contained fury. "We need to talk. Now." And just like that, the first steps of my plan began to take shape. Patrick agreed to meet me at a 24-hour diner just outside town. The place was nearly empty, save for a waitress chewing gum behind the counter and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I arrived first, my nerves stretched tight. The envelope sat on the table in front of me, its damning contents tucked neatly inside. Patrick walked in a few minutes later, looking as exhausted as I felt. He hesitated when he saw me, but eventually sat down across from me. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and he avoided my gaze for the first few moments. "I didn't want to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I thought you deserved to know." "You're damn right I did," I snapped. "Now tell me everything. How long has this been going on?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We got married 8 years ago. At the time, she said she was leaving someone, but..." I didn't know it was you until recently. She always said it was complicated, and I didn't press. 8 years? My voice rose, drawing a glance from the waitress. How does someone pull this off for 8 years? She's smart, he admitted, bitterness lacing his words. I work long hours, travel a lot for business. She had plenty of time to manage her lies. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my temper in check. And you're only telling me now because? Because I started noticing the cracks, he said, finally meeting my eyes. Little things that didn't add up. She'd disappear for weekends, saying she was visiting family. Then I found some receipts, hotel bookings, charges for dinners that weren't with me. I confronted her about it, and she admitted there was someone else. She never said it was you, though. Patrick's voice faltered. I had to dig to figure that out. She's good at covering her tracks. I leaned back in my seat, trying to process it all. This wasn't just a fling or some midlife crisis. This was a web of deceit that stretched back nearly a decade. So, what now? What do you want from me? Patrick's jaw tightened. I don't want anything from you. But you have to know, this isn't just about us. It's bigger than that. I frowned. What the hell are you talking about? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table. She's not who you think she is. Neither of us know her, Ethan. Not really. What's on this? I asked, eyeing the drive like it might explode. Proof, he said simply. Of who she really is. I stared at the drive, suspicion and curiosity battling for control. What kind of proof? Patrick hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Look, I didn't want to believe it either, but I hired a private investigator. What he found, Jesus, it's not just infidelity. It's worse. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Worse how? Patrick lowered his voice, glancing around the diner. She's been conning us, Ethan. Both of us. She has other identities, other lives. This isn't her first marriage, and I doubt it'll be her last. She's been doing this for years, marrying men, draining them financially, and moving on. She's a goddamn professional. The words hit me like a freight train. You're saying my wife is, what? A scam artist? I'm saying she's dangerous, he said, his voice trembling. You think this is bad? It gets worse. There are men out there who've lost everything because of her. Money, homes, businesses. Some of them just disappeared. Disappeared? My voice cracked. Patrick nodded grimly. One of the men the PI tracked down? He was digging into her past, trying to expose her. 2 weeks later, he was found dead. Official cause was suicide, but the timing, it's suspicious, to say the least. I sat there, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It sounded like something out of a bad thriller, but Patrick's expression was dead serious. He wasn't lying, at least, not intentionally. Why are you telling me this now? I demanded. Why not go to the police? I tried, he admitted. But without solid proof, they won't do anything. That's why I need you. Between the two of us, we can figure this out. We can stop her. I stared at him, unsure whether to believe him or punch him. My entire life felt like it was spiraling out of control, and now he was asking me to team up with him against my own wife. But as much as I hated to admit it, he wasn't wrong. If Clara was half as dangerous as he claimed, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I need to see what's on this drive, I said finally, pocketing it. But if you're lying to me. I'm not, Patrick interrupted. And you'll see that soon enough. We left the diner separately, Patrick disappearing into the night while I headed home, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. The house was dark when I arrived, Clara still out with her so-called friends. I locked myself in my office, plugged the drive into my computer, and braced myself for what I was about to uncover. The files were a mix of documents, photos, and videos, all meticulously organized. As I clicked through them, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Patrick hadn't been lying. There were marriage certificates in multiple states, tax records under different names, and photos of Clara, or whatever her real name was, with other men. I sat back, my hands trembling. My wife wasn't just a cheater or a liar. She was a predator. And I was her next victim. I sat in the dim light of my office, the weight of everything I'd uncovered pressing down on me. Clara wasn't just a liar or a cheater, she was dangerous. The evidence on that USB drive wasn't just damning, it was horrifying. I couldn't let her get away with it. Not after everything she'd done, not after all the lives she'd destroyed, and not after she had tried to do the same to me. The first step was making sure I was in control. Clara was out of the house, so I seized the opportunity to secure everything I'd need. I backed up the files from the USB drive to multiple places, a cloud storage account, an encrypted hard drive, and even an old thumb drive I'd shoved in the back of a toolbox in the garage. I wasn't going to take any chances. If Clara found out I had this, I needed backups. The next morning, I started making calls. The first was to Josh, an old friend who owed me a favor. He worked in cybersecurity, and I needed his help digging deeper into Clara's financial activities. I wasn't interested in speculation, I wanted hard facts. A few days later, he called back with more than I expected. "She's got offshore accounts," Josh explained. 3 of them. Big deposits, regular transfers, all under different names. "It's not just fraud, it looks like she's preparing to vanish. She's liquidating assets and funneling the cash out of the country." It took everything in me to keep my composure. "How much are we talking?" "Hundreds of thousands, at least," Josh replied. "But that's just what I've found so far. If she's been at this as long as it looks, there's probably more." I hung up, feeling a surge of anger so intense it made my hands tremble. Clara wasn't just planning to leave me, she was preparing to gut me financially and disappear like I'd never existed. But if she thought she was going to get away with it, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Next, I hired a private investigator named Diane. She came highly recommended, a no-nonsense type who got results. I handed her everything I had, the USB drive, Josh's findings, and even Patrick's file. She promised to have answers within a week. While Diane worked, I focused on setting my own plans in motion. I called the bank and froze our joint accounts, citing suspicious activity. Clara would notice soon, but I wasn't worried. By then, I'd have the upper hand. Diane's report came in faster than I expected. It was thick, detailed, and damning. Clara's real name wasn't Clara, it was Sarah. She'd been married 4 times, each marriage ending with her walking away richer while the husbands were left in ruins. She had a history of faking identities, forging documents, and even using her partner's names to open lines of credit. But the worst part wasn't the financial crimes, it was the disappearances. One of her ex-husbands, a man named David, had gone missing after trying to expose her. Diane's report included a police file. David's car was found abandoned near a lake, but his body was never recovered. The case was ruled a probable suicide, but Diane wasn't convinced. Neither was I. I spent the next few days preparing for the confrontation. I wanted every detail locked in my mind, every piece of evidence ready to use. Clara had spent years playing games with other people's lives, and now it was her turn to lose. On Saturday, Clara left the house in the morning, saying she had errands to run. I sent the kids to stay with my sister, under the pretense of giving Clara and me some alone time. In reality, I wanted them far away from what was about to happen. When Clara came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the living room. On the coffee table was everything, the photos, the documents, the bank statements, and the USB drive. She froze when she saw it, her eyes darting from the evidence to me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady but her expression betrayed her unease. "This," I said, gesturing to the table, "is who you really are. And it's over, Clara. Or should I call you Sarah?" Her face paled, but she quickly tried to recover. "You've been spying on me? Don't try to turn this around on me," I snapped. "I know everything. The lies, the fake identities, the money you've stolen. Hell, I even know about David. That got her attention. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, I said. I know you've been planning to disappear. I know about the offshore accounts. And I know that if I don't stop you, you'll destroy me and the kids without a second thought. She crossed her arms, her voice cold. What do you want, Ethan? I want you out of my life, I said. You're going to pack your things and leave. You'll sign over full custody of the kids, and you won't fight it. In return, I won't go to the police. She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. And if I refuse? Then I take all of this to the authorities, I said, pointing to the pile on the table. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, Clara. Do you really think you can talk your way out of that? Her composure cracked for the first time. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked almost human. Fine, she muttered. You win. But as she turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Clara wasn't the type to give up without a fight. And as much as I wanted to believe I'd won, a part of me knew the war was far from finished. Clara stayed in the guest room that night, the first time we'd ever spent a night under the same roof without sharing a bed. I barely slept, lying awake in my room, the door locked and the evidence secured in a safe. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, set me on edge. I kept replaying our confrontation in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake letting her stay even one more night. By morning, the house was silent. I half expected Clara to have already packed her things and left, but when I went downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. Her calmness was unnerving, as if she wasn't the same woman I'd exposed less than 12 hours earlier. You're up early, she said, her voice casual, almost cheerful. I didn't reply, just poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. For a long moment, we stared at each other, the tension between us so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Have you thought about what happens next? She asked finally, breaking the silence. You're leaving, I said flatly. That's all that matters. She smirked, leaning back in her chair. You really think it's that simple, don't you? Just throw me out, and your life goes back to normal. That's exactly what's going to happen, I shot back. You're not going to ruin my life any more than you already have. Ruin your life? She laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Ethan, you're the one who ruined it. You're so predictable, so boring. I was suffocating in this house, in this marriage, and you didn't even notice. I clenched my fists, biting back the anger bubbling inside me. So, what? That justifies everything? The lies, the cheating, the scams? You've been conning people for years, Clara. Don't act like you're some victim in all this. Her smirk faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. And what are you, Ethan? Some hero? You think you're better than me because you've backed me into a corner? You're just as complicit as I am. I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her words. Complicit? Are you out of your mind? I didn't do anything. Exactly, she said, leaning forward. You didn't do anything. You didn't ask questions when things didn't add up. You didn't push back when I disappeared for days. You just let it happen. You're so desperate to believe in this fantasy of a perfect family that you ignored every warning sign. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I had ignored the signs, excused her behavior, convinced myself that everything was fine because I didn't want to face the alternative. But that didn't absolve her. It didn't make what she'd done any less monstrous. You can't twist this around on me, I said, my voice steady. You're the one who lied. You're the one who built this house of cards, and now it's falling apart. That's on you, not me. For a moment, Clara's mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, maybe, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold indifference she'd shown the night before. Fine, she said, standing up. If this is how you want it, I'll leave. But don't think for a second that this is over. Are you threatening me? I asked, standing as well. She smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. I don't need to threaten you, Ethan. You'll see soon enough. With that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara packed her things without a word, loading them into her car while I watched from the living room window. I didn't trust her to leave without pulling something, but she seemed almost serene, as if she'd already made her peace with whatever was coming next. When she finally left, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The house was quiet, empty, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the calm before a storm. That evening, I sat down with the kids to explain what was happening. I didn't go into details, they were too young to understand the full extent of Clara's betrayal, but I told them enough to prepare them for the changes ahead. They took it better than I expected, though Sarah, my oldest, asked me point-blank if it was her fault. The question broke my heart, but I assured her it wasn't, that none of this was on them. The next morning, I received a call from Diane. She'd been keeping tabs on Clara, and her tone was urgent. "You need to be careful," she said. "She's not done. She's already making moves to retaliate." "What kind of moves?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "She's contacting people," Diane explained. "Patrick, 4-1. She's trying to spin the story, make herself look like the victim. And there's more, she's been reaching out to old associates, people she's worked with before." "What does that mean for me?" "It means she's not just walking away," Diane said. "She's plotting something, Ethan. I don't know what yet, but you need to be ready." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Clara was gone, but she wasn't finished. She'd made that clear during our last conversation. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days passed in tense silence, each hour dragging as I waited for the other shoe to drop. I'd underestimated Clara before, her ability to deceive, manipulate, and play the long game, and I wasn't about to make that mistake again. Diane's warning haunted me, her words looping in my head every time I thought about letting my guard down. Clara had left, but the shadow of her presence lingered everywhere. The kids were adjusting better than I expected, though they kept asking questions I couldn't answer. Why did Mom leave? When would she come back? Was it something they did? Each question chipped away at my resolve, but I held firm, giving them the simplest answers I could. The truth would come out eventually, but they didn't need the burden of it right now. I spent most of my time preparing for the inevitable fallout. I tightened my security, both at home and online, making sure Clara couldn't access anything she'd left behind. I alerted the bank to watch for any suspicious activity and worked with Diane to track her movements. Clara might have been gone physically, but she wasn't out of the fight. And then it came. I was at work when Diane called again, her voice brisk and to the point. "She's filed a restraining order against you," she said. "What?" I couldn't hide the shock in my voice. "She's claiming harassment," Diane explained. "Says you've been stalking her, threatening her. She even provided fake emails and messages as evidence." "That's ridiculous." I snapped. "I haven't contacted her once since she left." "I know," Diane said. "But it doesn't matter. It's her word against yours, and right now, she's trying to paint herself as the victim." I sat back in my chair, trying to process the news. Clara was turning the tables, using the same tactics that had worked so well for her in the past. She wasn't content to disappear quietly, she wanted to burn everything down on her way out. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. "Stay calm," Diane advised. "We'll fight this, but you need to be smart. Don't react emotionally, and don't give her any ammunition to use against you." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Clara's move was calculated, designed to put me on the defensive while she worked behind the scenes. But if she thought I'd roll over and let her win, she was wrong. The restraining order was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Clara ramped up her attacks, filing false police reports and spreading rumors about me to mutual acquaintances. She told anyone who would listen that I was abusive, that I'd driven her away, that I was unstable. It was a smear campaign, and it was working. Friends stopped calling. Coworkers began looking at me differently. Even the kids' teachers seemed distant, their polite smiles tinged with suspicion. Clara was poisoning everything I'd built, piece by piece, and I felt powerless to stop her. But then Diane called with good news. "We've got her," she said, her voice triumphant. One of her old accomplices reached out to me. Apparently, Clara burned him too, and he's willing to testify against her. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. "What does he have?" I asked. "Everything," Diane said. "Emails, bank records, even recordings of their conversations. It's enough to blow her entire operation wide open." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal preparation. With Diane's help, I filed a countersuit against Clara, accusing her of fraud, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I wasn't just defending myself, I was going on the offensive. When the day of the hearing arrived, I walked into the courtroom with a mix of nerves and determination. Clara was there, sitting across the room with a smug look on her face, as if she'd already won. But as Diane laid out the evidence, her expression shifted. The recordings were the nail in the coffin. Clara's accomplice described in detail how she'd orchestrated her scams, including the false claims she'd made against me. The judge listened intently, his face unreadable, but by the end of the day, the tide had turned. Clara's restraining order was dismissed, her allegations against me declared baseless. The judge ordered an investigation into her activities, and within weeks, the authorities began closing in. The fallout was swift and brutal. Clara's house of cards collapsed under the weight of the evidence, and she fled the state before she could be arrested. Diane assured me they'd catch her eventually, but I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt free. Life didn't return to normal immediately. There were still scars, still questions from the kids that I struggled to answer. But we were healing, slowly but surely. I focused on rebuilding, on creating a life that couldn't be touched by Clara's lies. Looking back, I realized Clara had taught me something, though not in the way she intended. She'd shown me the importance of vigilance, of trusting my instincts, of never taking anything at face value. It was a hard lesson, one I wouldn't wish on anyone, but it made me stronger. In the end, Clara didn't destroy me. She didn't win. And that, I decided, was enough.